They slipped into the spaces where no one was watching, where the walls carried more secrets than the people who lived within them. Mine began in the summer of 2011, when I left the chaos of New York behind and returned to Charlotte, North Carolina, hoping for a reset, a quieter kind of life. I thought I was coming back to stability, but what I found was something that unsettled me more than the city ever had. It started slowly, so subtly that I almost convinced myself nothing was happening. A glance held for too long, a laugh that lingered a little deeper than it should have, the comfort of shared evenings that blurred into something else. I knew even then that if anyone ever found out, everything would collapse. And yet I didn't walk away. It wasn't that simple. The connection was too sharp, too undeniable, and it grew heavier with every day I spent in that house. No one suspected. No one asked questions. It remained ours alone, fragile and dangerous, until the moment it was forced into the open. And once it surfaced, there was no pulling it back, no undoing the truth we had let slip into the light. Her name was Rachel. She was 45, an English teacher at the local high school, divorced for several years, and known for her dry wit that often slipped past people who underestimated her. She carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that came from living through disappointments and finding ways to keep moving forward anyway. I was 25, barely holding myself together after leaving New York with nothing but a suitcase and the shame of a career that had fallen apart before it even began. Chris, my best friend since childhood and Rachel's son, had offered me a place to crash until I could find my footing again, but he was gone for the week visiting his girlfriend, leaving me in a house that didn't quite feel like mine. Rachel welcomed me without hesitation, though I felt out of place in her carefully kept home, a space filled with books, soft lighting, and small details that reflected the life of someone who paid attention to the things most people overlooked. That first night, we sat on the porch together. The air was thick with the lingering heat of a Carolina summer, the cicadas loud in the distance, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood around us. She made tea, not because either of us really wanted it in the warmth, but because it gave our hands something to do, something to hold. The porch light had gone out earlier in the evening, and I had tried to light an old kerosene lamp she kept near the steps. My clumsy attempts only made the flames sputter and die, and when she laughed, it wasn't mocking. It was light and unguarded, the kind of laughter that wrapped around me and made the moment feel less like a formality and more like something alive. I watched her then. The way her hair slipped loose from the tie at the back of her neck, the way her eyes seemed brighter when she laughed. There was an ease in her presence, the kind of calm that made me forget, just for a moment, the weight of my failures and the uncertainty of what came next. She wasn't trying to impress me, and I wasn't trying to prove anything to her. Still, there was something in the air that neither of us named, a subtle shift I felt in the way she lingered on the porch a little longer than she needed to, the way she let silence stretch comfortably between us. I told myself it was nothing, just the kindness of a woman used to taking care of people, someone who had raised a son and survived a divorce, someone who knew how to make others feel less alone. And yet, as the night deepened and the tea cooled in our cups, I realized I kept glancing at her when she wasn't looking, catching the curve of her smile, the quiet rhythm of her breathing as she leaned back in her chair. The cicadas grew louder, the lamp finally flickered to life, and the soft glow painted her face in a way that made her look younger and older at once, timeless in a way I couldn't explain. When I finally went inside that night, I couldn't shake the sound of her laughter from my head. It wasn't just kindness, though it held that too. It was deeper, sharper, like a spark in the dark that caught without warning. I lay awake on the unfamiliar couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering why a single moment on a porch in Charlotte felt heavier than the years I had left behind in New York. Something had shifted, and even if I couldn't name it, I knew it had already taken hold. The next evening the house smelled alive, the way homes do when someone cooks not just to eat but to create comfort. Rachel stood in the kitchen stirring pasta while basil and garlic filled the air, clinging to the walls and wrapping around me as if I had stepped into a memory I didn't know I had. The clatter of pa-and-s, the hiss of boiling water, the scrape of a wooden spoon against the pot, all of it blended into a rhythm that felt strangely intimate. I leaned against the counter pretending to be useful, though she hardly needed me there. She moved with an ease that made the ordinary seem deliberate, each gesture carrying the weight of habit and care. When the pasta was done, she set 2 plates on the small oak table by the window. The last of the evening light streamed in, painting everything gold for a few fleeting minutes before the dark closed in. She poured a glass of red wine for each of us, sliding mine across the table with a casual grace that somehow didn't feel casual at all. The clink of the glass against the wood was louder than it should have been, as if the air between us amplified every sound. We ate slowly, talking about nothing important, books, movies, small things about the city. But beneath the conversation, something else lingered. There were pauses, moments when her eyes stayed on me longer than they should have, moments when I felt the silence pulse with something unspoken. At one point, I noticed her necklace, a simple silver chain with a charm in the shape of the letter R. It rested just above her collarbone, catching the light every time she leaned forward. I caught myself staring, tracing the way it moved against her skin when she breathed. She noticed. I expected her to adjust it, to break the spell by pulling the necklace back into place, but she didn't. Instead, she left it where it was, as though daring me to keep looking. The corner of her mouth curved into the faintest smile, one I couldn't read fully, and yet it held me in place. I shifted in my chair, but the weight of her gaze followed, steady and warm, until I felt exposed in a way I hadn't in years. Her hand rested on the table close to mine. She could have drawn it back when the distance between us became too small to ignore, but she didn't. She let it remain there, fingers relaxed, close enough that I could sense the warmth without touching. The space between our hands became its own kind of tension, a line we hadn't crossed, but both of us acknowledged by not moving. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet of the porch the night before. This silence was charged, deliberate, thick with something that pressed against both of us. I felt the question rise in my chest, unspoken but heavy, and for a second I thought she might answer it without words. Instead, we just sat there, the sound of forks against plates fading, the wine untouched, the air heavy with a secret that hadn't yet been named but already existed. When I left the table that night, the taste of garlic and basil lingered on my tongue, but stronger than that was the memory of her hand, her necklace, her gaze that didn't let me go. Something had shifted again, subtle but undeniable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the quiet hints became impossible to ignore. That night the house felt different, quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat with Rachel in the living room, the lamps casting a muted glow that softened the edges of everything. Books were scattered on the coffee table, some open, some stacked, as though we had been reaching for them without really needing to read. We talked about stories we loved, about authors who said things we were too afraid to say ourselves. Our voices were low, not because anyone could hear us, but because the silence around us demanded that we not disturb it. Rachel leaned back into the armchair, her frame sinking into the cushions, her face touched by shadows. The glass of wine in her hand caught the light every time she shifted, a small glimmer in the dim room. Her movements were slow, almost deliberate, and I noticed the way her fingers lingered on the rim of the glass, circling it absent-mindedly, as if she was trying to ground herself. She spoke about how books held truths people rarely admitted in their own lives, how fiction gave permission to speak what reality often silenced. Her words carried something beneath them, something unspoken but heavy, and I felt it press against me more than the heat of the summer night ever could. She asked me if I ever thought people spent half their lives pretending. The question wasn't casual. It slipped out softly, like a confession disguised as a thought. The air shifted after she said it, thickening between us. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched the way her eyes seemed both guarded and vulnerable at once, like she had already revealed more than she intended. Her hand kept tracing the glass, slow and steady, and I felt an ache in my chest, the urge to reach out and close the space between us. My fingers twitched against my knee as though my body was already moving before my mind could stop it. But before I could act, before the silence could lead us where it wanted to, my phone buzzed on the table. The sound was jarring, too sharp, cutting through the moment like a blade. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Chris. He wrote that he would be back in the morning. Simple words, harmless in themselves, but they carried the weight of reality crashing back into the room. The air shifted again, colder this time, pulling me out of the haze that had drawn me so close to her. Rachel's eyes flicked from the phone to me. There was no anger, no visible frustration, just a look that held the truth neither of us had spoken. In her gaze, I saw the acknowledgement of what had already happened, not in touch, but in thought, in the way we had crossed lines without crossing them. We sat there, both of us silent, both of us aware that something irreversible had taken place. I felt my pulse in my throat, the weight of her question still lingering, and yet there was nothing left to say. The moment had fractured, but the truth of it remained, heavy and undeniable in the space between us. A few days passed before the tension returned in a way I hadn't expected. It was late afternoon when David, Rachel's ex-husband, appeared at the door. He came to pick up a few things for Chris, who had left some of his belongings at the house. David looked the way men often did when they thought the world still revolved around them. Tall, fit, a tan that seemed permanent, and a grin that carried more arrogance than warmth. His presence filled the doorway like an intrusion, reminding me suddenly that Rachel's life stretched far beyond the quiet bubble we had been building. He greeted me with a tone that was almost friendly, but just sharp enough to remind me I didn't belong. "Looks like you've settled in," he said, too casually, his eyes lingering in ways that carried implication. Rachel stood beside him, her body stiff, her jaw tight, as though every muscle had braced itself the second she saw him. I felt the atmosphere shift, the room growing smaller, the air sharper, every second dragging longer than it should have. David moved through the space like it was still his, glancing at the framed photos, brushing his hand along the edge of the table, acting as though time hadn't severed his claim. When he finally left, the door closing behind him, the silence that followed was heavy and raw. Rachel didn't move right away. She stood in the middle of the room, her arms crossed, her face unreadable, and then she whispered, almost to herself, that she didn't want to be someone's mistake again. The words fell like stones into the space between us, quiet but heavy enough to shift everything I thought I knew about her. There was pain threaded through her voice, the kind that doesn't vanish even when years pass, the kind that lingers in the corners of a person's life no matter how carefully they try to cover it. I looked at her, not sure if she meant me, or us, or simply the weight of her past pressing against the present. I wanted to say something, to ease the sharp edge of her confession, and what came out was the only truth I had. What if this wasn't a mistake? The words felt reckless as soon as I let them go, but also necessary, pulled from somewhere I couldn't suppress. She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she sat at the table, her movements slow and deliberate, her hand resting against the surface as though it had nowhere else to go. She placed it near mine, not touching, but closer than it should have been. It was the same gesture as before, yet heavier this time, weighted by everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. The silence grew again, wrapping around us, but it wasn't empty. It was full of questions, of hesitation, of desire neither of us dared to name. The house felt too quiet after that, the air almost electric with restraint. Every sound, the creak of the chair, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, even the clock ticking in the hallway, felt sharper, amplified by the tension sitting between our hands. I kept staring at hers, at the veins running beneath the skin, at the way her fingers curved ever so slightly, as if waiting for an answer that couldn't be spoken aloud. I didn't move. Neither did she. And yet, in that stillness, the space between us seemed to burn. It was close to midnight when I heard her footsteps in the hallway. The house was dark, silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner pushing against the heavy August heat. I sat on the edge of the bed, half reading, half lost in thought, when the door creaked open. Rachel stepped inside without hesitation. Her hair was tied back, loose strands framing her face, and her eyes carried a steadiness that I hadn't seen before. She didn't waver, didn't look away. The soft light spilling from the hallway behind her made the room feel smaller, more enclosed, like the world had shrunk to just the two of us. She didn't ask permission to enter. She simply closed the door behind her, walked across the carpet with quiet, certain steps, and stopped in front of me. Her voice was low but clear when she said she was tired of pretending. The words hung in the air between us, undeniable, and with them something shifted. I felt the gravity of what she meant, the acknowledgement of everything we had been circling around. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with the overwhelming certainty that the moment we had been avoiding had finally arrived. She reached for my hand, and when her fingers brushed against mine, it was like the silence cracked open. I leaned forward, instinct carrying me closer to her, and for the first time it didn't feel like hesitation. It felt like inevitability. Her hand was warm in mine, her eyes unflinching, and I knew that if nothing interrupted us, we would cross the line completely. But before we could, the front door slammed. The sound was sharp, shattering, ripping us out of the fragile bubble we had built in that small, dim room. We both froze. The voice that followed was unmistakable. Chris, calling out into the house, asking if his mom was awake, if I was around. His tone was casual, almost cheerful, but in that moment it felt like a spotlight turning directly onto us. Rachel pulled her hand away instantly, her body moving with a swiftness that was almost practiced, as if she had prepared for this very possibility. The steadiness in her eyes faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic. We didn't speak. There wasn't time. We moved quickly, slipping into the kitchen as though we had been there all along. She put the kettle on. I pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, and within seconds we had built a scene that might have convinced anyone who hadn't already seen the truth. Chris walked in, dropping his bag by the door, his face flushed from the night air. He looked at us, at the tea on the counter, at the 2 of us standing a little too far apart, our movements just a little too deliberate. He didn't say anything at first, but I could feel his eyes scanning, searching, putting pieces together that neither of us wanted him to have. Rachel asked if he wanted tea. He shook his head and mumbled something about being tired. He went to his room, but the weight of his glance lingered long after the sound of his footsteps disappeared down the hall. Later, as I stepped into the hallway, the dim light from the bathroom casting long shadows on the walls, Chris was waiting. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression hard to read, but his eyes were sharp. He asked me to tell him the truth. He asked what was going on. His voice was low, but it carried more force than if he had shouted. I couldn't answer. Words stuck in my throat, the silence stretching longer with each second that passed. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet long enough, the moment would collapse on itself, but instead it did the opposite. My silence told him everything I couldn't admit aloud. His face changed as the realization set in, the sharpness softening into something else. Disbelief, disappointment, hurt. He didn't push further. He just turned away, his shoulders heavy, his steps slow as he walked back into his room. The hallway remained still, but I felt the fracture deep in my chest. What had been unspoken was now exposed, not through words, but through the silence that had given us away. Chris moved out within a week. The decision came quickly, without shouting, without a dramatic scene, but its impact was brutal all the same. His room went empty, stripped of posters and clothes, leaving only the outline of where his bed had stood and the faint scent of cologne that hadn't yet faded. The house felt different the moment he left, hollow, as though the walls themselves had lost the warmth they once carried. Every step echoed louder, every quiet pause stretched longer, and Rachel moved through it like someone searching for something she couldn't find. I watched her in the kitchen that evening, her hands restless as she opened and closed cabinets, pulled mugs out only to set them back again, filled the kettle, and let it sit without turning on the stove. Her face carried the weight of someone who hadn't slept, her body taut with a tension she couldn't shake. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked beneath the surface of control. She said I'll lose her son, and it was less confession than surrender. The words hung between us like a sentence neither of us could argue against. I told her I knew. I tried to steady my voice, but it betrayed me, thin and raw, as if the truth inside me had been stripped bare. She turned toward me then, her eyes softer than they had been in days, and for a moment it felt like we were back in that first night on the porch, before everything had become complicated. She stepped closer, her hand reaching up to my face, her touch gentle in a way that both soothed and destroyed me. She said I had been real, and I felt the ache in her words, the way she meant them as both gift and goodbye. She said she had to be his mother now, not someone else's lover. There was no argument I could make, no plea that would change what had already been decided. She left before I could gather myself to respond, the sound of her keys in her hand sharp in the quiet house. The door shut behind her, and a few moments later her car engine started, the tires crunching over the gravel as she drove away. I stood frozen, unable to move. listening until the sound of her car faded completely into the night. The weeks that followed were blurred, heavy with absence. I found a small apartment downtown, the kind with thin walls and narrow windows that looked out onto streets humming with lives that didn't include me. I started working at a design studio, long hours that kept me busy but never distracted me fully. Life continued, the rhythm of days unfolding as though nothing had happened, but it all felt muted, dulled, as if the colors of the world had faded slightly. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of her. Passing her driveway on the way to work, I would see her car parked beneath the oak tree. At the school parking lot, I would spot her walking quickly, her bag over her shoulder, her expression focused but distant. We never spoke. We never even nodded. But those glimpses were enough to remind me of everything we had touched and everything we had lost. At night, when the apartment was too quiet and the city lights blinked outside my window, memories would surface with sharp clarity. The smell of basil and garlic in her kitchen, the sound of her laughter breaking across the summer porch, the fleeting press of her hand against mine in the dim light of a living room we pretended was harmless. These small moments returned uninvited, vivid enough to undo me all over again. They lingered like ghosts, not haunting in anger but in tenderness, the kind that ruins quietly, without spectacle, but completely.